Welcome everyone to our third webinar during Not-for-Profit Finance Week, The Art of Balancing Governance for Not-for-Profits. And a very warm welcome to our presenter today, Professor David Gilchrist from the University of Western Australia. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the presentation, and David will answer a select number of them at the end. There's a section to post your questions on the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, I just need to quickly do the disclaimer. So the information that we are covering is intended to provide you with general information of an educational nature only, and it doesn't take into account your individual objectives, financial situations or needs. So please consider its appropriateness for you before acting on any of the material we're covering today. So on that note, we're delighted to welcome our presenter for today, Professor David Gilchrist.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to our community and Commonwealth Bank for making this week available. I think it's a really important resource and it's great to be involved in it. The art of balancing governance for not-for-profits, I think, is a really important topic for us to consider. At the end of the day, I'd like to really talk about the context in which governance occurs for not-for-profit organisations, something on governance and not-for-profit charity perspectives compared to our for-profit cousins. I'd like to look at some specific issues around not-for-profits too, such as clinical governance, advocacy and human resources. But I'll also come back to and look at finance for not-for-profit organisations and the governance relationships there too. At the end of the day, not-for-profit governance is really a very different concept and considerations in relation to corporate governance and how that works. The comparison is a really important one because at the end of the day, a lot of commentary relates to corporate governance and we tend not to look at the differences between the two. One of the things that's really important to consider is the fact that there are a number of words that we often use when we talk about corporate governance that have specific meanings in the context of not-for-profits and charities. Not-for-profits and charities do a lot of work around human services, around education, and in many other areas where not only are there financial considerations, but there are also human outcome considerations that we really need to think about. So to that extent, we also need to be on the same page to make sure that we're aware of what these words mean for us in corporate governance, and to make sure that when I talk about things like resilience, efficiency, sustainability, objects and mission as we go through this presentation, you're all thinking the same things as I am. So for instance, in relation to resilience and not-for-profit governance, we're talking about the capacity of a not-for-profit corporation to maintain a heading, for it to be able to use its resources to pursue a strategic outcome regardless of the policy frameworks that might impact it from day to day. We're also really keen to think about efficiency in this regard. Often when we talk about efficiency, we talk about being able to provide something as cheaply as possible. But in fact, in our presentation today, efficiency means providing the best services for the least resources consumed, so that we are ensuring at the end of the day that the quality and clinical governance relating to the services is dealt with as best as possible. The third element that's really important and is very different from a corporate governance perspective in the for-profit world is the idea of sustainability. Sustainability for not-for-profit organisations relates to their capacity to undertake and pursue an object in an ongoing perspective. So from that perspective, what it means is that sustainability allows an organisation to be able to pursue its mission and its objects, regardless again of the policy frameworks that might be impacting that organisation from day to day. This is very different to for-profit organisations where corporate sustainability means the survivorship of the corporation rather than necessarily the purpose of that entity. Objects are also important to consider. They really recognise and identify the purpose of the organisation. What is it there to do? What is its purpose? What is it trying to change in this community? Where, when and how is also a really important aspect, which we tend to refer to as mission. A mission of an organisation helps us to determine what we do, where we do it, how we do it, and also what constitutes success when we undertake that process. At the end of the day, unlike a commercial for-profit organisation, a charity corporation is not set up for a purpose in itself. In other words, a charity corporation has a mission or objects which are actually the driving tool of the organisation itself, the driving purpose of the organisation itself. It's hard to see. One of the things I'd like to do though is talk about the white noise. Organisations operate in a society, in a political and economic environment that does impact the governance structure of the organisation, because that environment impacts the way things operate. At the end of the day, some of the key white noise that directors need to deal with when they're talking about governance in charities and not-for-profits include structural ambiguity. For instance, a lot of funding now is attempting to use market mechanisms to ensure quality and responsiveness of service providers to the needs of people using those services. Indeed, we often talk about things like choice and control. We also talk about markets and the need for organisations to take a market approach to the way they operate. This structural ambiguity is very hard for those charged with governance, because at the end of the day, there are many other impacts on being able to pursue the mission and the objects of the organisation beyond that structural ambiguity, that mean that you need to make decisions in full knowledge of what your organisation is about, not necessarily in full knowledge of what the broader policy or economic framework might mean for you. Secondly, we often talk in that economic and policy framework that there is a need for organisations to structure in order to be competitive within their subsector. I think competition is a really important issue, but it's not necessarily the driving force for corporate governance for these organisations. And again, directors need to be fairly sure about what they're doing and how they're doing it in order to approach this competitive element as effectively as possible. The third element to be thinking about, of course, is funding versus costs. And this is a really important element when we think about clinical governance issues, such as whether or not we have sufficient resources to be able to provide the best clinical outcome for those people who are using our services. Funding versus costs is also a really important thing for directors to be thinking about, because in the commercial world, you would restructure your organisation to meet your income capacity. In the not-for-profit and charitable world, particularly when we talk about human services, we need to think a little bit more broadly about the potential impact that cutting funding has on our clinical ability, and whether or not cutting those costs and cutting those resources is really the best thing for the people that we serve. In other words, some of that white noise relates to a lot of people talking about NFPs needing to be more business-like. NFPs must compete, and indeed, we often talk about markets. All of these things create white noise that potentially derails directors and the roles that they undertake in terms of governing their organisation, because of the rhetoric that's been floating around the sector. The other aspects about white noise that are really important is that as those charged with governance need to be thinking about what kinds of policy and economic frameworks they're operating in, they also need to think about what kind of impact market economics, the transfer of risk from government to not-for-profits, and the clinical risk and mitigations that are not factored into funding has on those organisations and the risk that directors face. The third element that's really important is that at the end of the day, advocacy is also increasingly important, but can also have political ramifications where governments and others are increasingly pressuring not-for-profits and charitable organisations not to advocate on behalf of the sector or on behalf of their clients. This is a really important issue for people to be thinking about, because at the end of the day, those charged with governance do have an obligation to advocate, not just in relation to their clients and their organisation, but the broader system as well. And that means that they potentially face risks in relation to funding and other things that might impact the organisation going forward. I think the big thing is, and as I go through this presentation, I'll talk a lot about red flags to try and give you an idea of some of the key things that you need to think about and contemplate as a board going forward. The first red flag is the fact that governments, philanthropists, commentators can all say what they like, but directors of NFPs are responsible for how NFPs and charities respond to the operating environment that they find themselves in. So in other words, while there are plenty of people out there with opinions about how you should approach governance, there's plenty of people out there with opinions about what you should do and how you should do it. At the end of the day, it's actually the not-for-profit governors, the directors, who take full responsibility for what they're doing and who need to be sure about that they've got the right responses for the kinds of issues that they're facing as an organisation. So what about governance and governance frameworks? I guess first and foremost, it would be great to start off answering the question, what is governance? And I think this is really important for not-for-profits and charities for the reasons I outlined before, not least of which the fact that at the end of the day, not-for-profit and charitable governance is similar to, but does have different objectives to those found in corporate and for-profit world. So we take a fairly simple look at governance, and that is that corporate governance is about the way the organisation is directed and controlled. Indeed, corporate governance deals with the policies and practices that directly impact your organisation's performance and stewardship and its capacity to be accountable to its various stakeholders. In other words, corporate governance is really about how the directors and the executives get the corporation to do the things they want it to do, when they want it done, and how they want it done. Fundamental and certainly very easy to say, but of course there's much more complexity around actually working within an organisation to achieve these outcomes. It is holistic, but risks need to be prioritised and mitigated in accordance with impact on staff, clients, and then the corporate entity itself. In other words, there are many, many risks facing any organisation in the modern policy and community settings that not-for-profits and charities operate in. But directors also need to be able to prioritise and to mitigate the key risks that they face. And so that corporate governance and developing and changing the governance framework is a never-ending process of prioritisation and mitigation and continuing on into eternity essentially, but to be able to improve that governance cycle on an annual basis is a really important issue. How do we deal with that? How do we actually get the corporation to do the things we want it to do? Obviously, we think about values. We think about the context in which the organisation operates. And of course, mission and time are two really important things. At the end of the day, though, these things are all the same for commercial organisations too. Commercial organisations often talk about values. Obviously, they work in a political and economic context the way that same as not-for-profits do. They tend to talk about having missions, and they also operate within a time frame, and so have strategic priorities and governance priorities associated with that time frame. The difference is that the points of emphasis and definition of achievement are different for not-for-profit organisations. So too is the risk profile for those organisations. So let's just look at some of the basics. First and foremost, in relation to responsibilities of board members, both for-profit and not-for-profit organisations have similar lists of responsibilities that directors need to undertake and mitigate. So things like seeking to achieve constitutional objectives remain the same for both for-profit and not-for-profit. To deliver clinically appropriate services, high quality services, regulatory appropriate services are similar for both. To maintain and develop financial resources for the organisation and to meet financial risks are also relevant to both types of organisations. Establishing governance policies, meeting legal and statutory requirements, monitoring ethical standards, ensuring a positive industrial climate, all of these things are germane to not-for-profits and for-profit organisations. But again, the emphasis and the objectives of these governance arrangements can be different for both organisation styles. At the end of the day, governance is about control. It is about delivering instructions, structures and frameworks for decision making and for operations for the organisation. But the third, and perhaps one of the most important aspects of governance too, is to achieve the confirmation that the control instructions, the policies and procedures that are mandated by the board are actually being put in place. So not only do we have to create the appropriate policies and frameworks, we also have to make sure that those frameworks are being implemented as we expected to. So confirmation, or what we call assurance, is a really important part of that governance framework as well. So the fundamental elements of governance for not-for-profits and charities have been put into the following 4 pillars, probably for ease of explanation, but also for us to be able to understand some of the key things and to prioritise the key things relative to each organisation. It also helps me in this webinar to be able to talk about organisations in the general sense. And while there are 4 key elements identified here and presented here, and which I will talk to, of course, other organisations have different things that they might need to focus on, different governance risks that they might need to mitigate. And so at the end of the day, we would say that about 80% of successful governance relates to these 4 pillars, and probably another 20% of elements might be germane to the particular organisation or specific to the subsector in which the organisation operates. At the end of the day, though, we tend to talk about quality of service delivery, governance maturity, human resources management maturity, and financial strength as being fairly key and important fundamental elements for any director of a not-for-profit or charity organisation to get their heads around. What does it mean? It means that governance and reporting processes should address these pillars. So should the assurance framework, to make sure that the policies and frameworks established by the board are actually being fulfilled as the board would expect within the organisation, thus closing that governance loop. So I guess in terms of one key purpose of this webinar, to be able to look at how charities and not-for-profit organisations compared to for-profit corporations in relation to governance, it's really important perhaps to start to look at some examples in that regard. If we use those 4 pillars as our basis, in this slide you can see that looking down some of the key governance elements relevant to commercial and not-for-profit organisations, we've also tried to highlight what the differences might be between those 2 styles of corporation. For instance, when we look at financial sustainability, as you can see, a commercial response to financial sustainability risks relate to a number of things, not least of which that commercial organisations will shift their capital to the best return. And this is appropriate because they have an obligation to return a profit to their shareholders, and they need to make sure that they're using their capital as best they can. Like not-for-profit organisations, balance sheet sustainability is really important, that you're able to in the short term pay your bills, but in the longer term be able to replace your assets and apply those assets appropriately. And of course, in the short term for both commercial and not-for-profit organisations, financial sustainability means being solvent, not trading insolvent. What is different in financial terms, though, is that not-for-profit and charitable organisations often find that their capital is immobile. That is, they can't simply change from one subsector to the other because there are often entry hurdles that make it very difficult, but also there's a mission and a set of objects for the organisation that means that its capital is really intended to pursue that particular mission or object, and it's very difficult for an organisation to be able to change horses, so to speak, in terms of how it might apply its financial resources. In terms of clinical sustainability, this is also a really important issue. Both commercial and not-for-profit organisations face clinical sustainability governance issues. That is, those issues and risks that are associated with providing services to people and in relation to some of the things that can go wrong in that particular process. But the way commercial organisations tend to respond to clinical sustainability is that they develop their service matrix to reduce risk in the financial context. What does that mean? It means that they have a tendency to look at the lower risk, lower clinical risk services and to provide those services in order to achieve a greater financial return on their activities. On the other hand, not-for-profit and charitable organisations have a tendency to develop their service matrix to meet their mission. In other words, They shouldn't be looking at finances first, but rather looking at what their mission and objects are and developing their service matrix. So the service matrix being those people to whom they provide services to, where those people are and what kinds of services they might actually provide. These things are encompassed in their mission and objects as organisations. That's very different to for-profit organisations that can be more flexible in relation to that aspect. In relation to advocacy, generally speaking, for-profit organisations have no advocacy responsibilities in their general operations. They tend to advocate when there are attacks or other implications out of political policies, but at the end of the day, advocacy doesn't form a great part of what they do. On the other hand, not-for-profit and charitable organisations have an obligation to undertake systemic and client advocacy. That is, they have an obligation to be able to advocate to ensure the system works to the client's best advantage, and also to advocate to make sure that their individual clients are receiving the resources that they need in order to be able to utilise those resources as best they can. There are other elements as well that are really important, for instance, in relation to unfunded service delivery. Commercial organisations really are under no obligation to undertake service delivery that doesn't receive funding, whereas from a mission focus perspective, often organisations that are not-for-profit or charities undertake unfunded service delivery on a regular basis. An example used here is where an organisation won't turn away people who are unfunded and acts as a provider of last resort. For instance, under the National Disability Insurance Scheme at the moment, many states and territories don't have a provider of last resort arrangement in place. And so charities and not-for-profits tend to provide services that might not be provided if they were for-profit organisations. The second last element that's really important to think about in terms of the differences between the two includes profitability. Profitability is important for a for-profit organisation, and appropriately so. As I mentioned before, they have an obligation to return a profit to their shareholders, and they also have an obligation in order for the organisation to be financially sustainable, for it to be profitable into the future. In other words, commercial organisations are profitable in order to ensure a return on capital. On the other hand, not-for-profit organisations and charities can't dividend any profit. They can't make distributions to members or to others. And indeed, the profit's purpose is to maintain service capacity. That is, for the organisation to be able to replace assets, to be able to invest in itself in order to be able to innovate and undertake change, and to use that profit to build the financial resources for further service delivery over time. The final point on this slide, as you can see, relates to stakeholder focus, and principally commercial or for-profit organisations quite rightly have a focus on their shareholders, the providers of capital, whereas not-for-profits and charities tend to have a much more wider stakeholder audience, including service recipients, their natural support, so their families and friends, but also philanthropists, fundraisers, funders, and many others who have a direct relationship with the not-for-profit and charity organisation, and for whom directors of those organisations really need to be thinking when they're thinking about their governance transparency obligations. So you need to frame governance responses within these parameters, not being driven by the rhetoric, the commentary, and the political or other environments, but thinking about your governance responsibilities in the context of NFP responses that are relevant to these key risk areas. One of the things that's really important, as I mentioned before, relates to advocacy. And this slide is a slide that's been developed by my colleague Penny Knight and I, as we've undertaken a review of the National Disabilities Insurance Scheme, and particularly sustainability of disability organisations over time. This chart actually relates to data that was collected in 2017. The reason I've provided this chart is because I think it also goes to a difference between not-for-profit and for-profit organisations, in the sense that, as you can see, profit makers in this particular chart have service shifted towards where they can retain greater income for the services that they provide. There's a circle over therapy services in this chart, and under the NDIS, therapy services are actually paid quite handsomely in relation to other services that are provided under the disability scheme. On the other hand, as you can see, supported employment services, or ADE, are actually relatively lowly compensated. And so organisations have clearly moved from providing services in other areas to providing therapy services in response to that profit-making capacity that's inherent in providing that particular service. Now, that's not necessarily a wrong decision, but I think it is an important decision for not-for-profit and charitable directors to be aware of, because at the end of the day, there are real needs for supported employment that may not be met as a result of organisations looking to profitability as a driver of their service outcomes. At the end of the day, those people who need employment support are also part of the mission and objects of not-for-profit and charitable organisations, and so they need to pursue those missions and objects faithfully. The other element that's important to consider in relation to governance relates to the regulatory framework that organisations face. This is very complex for not-for-profit organisations because it really does depend on the state and territory in which they are registered. Will have a different governance arrangement and regulatory environment in which they have to operate. For the purposes of today, though, I just simply want to highlight the ACNC governance regulations, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, which technically only apply to those registered entities, so charities in Australia, but which I think are also important for not-for-profits organisations and their directors to consider. I think the the ACNC governance regulations are really important. They're actually applied by regulation, so they're appended to the ACNC Act, but they're principles based. And this is important because it recognises that not all charities and not-for-profits are the same, and it allows directors to really consider how they and their organisation meets the principles that are set under those governance regulations. Indeed, under those regulations, there are 5 standards. Each of those standards are listed here, and it's incumbent upon charitable directors to be able to explain and demonstrate how their organisation meets each of those objectives. Similarly, for not-for-profit organisations that are, say, registered as associations or as cooperatives or in any other sense, I think these governance regulations will also help those directors to be able to understand best how they should approach governance, and particularly how they might demonstrate their governance to the stakeholders that they have in their organisation. So going back to those governance priorities, I now want to start to talk to some specific issues and some specific mitigations to those issues that directors might take into consideration as they move forward. So I'll have a look at clinical governance, some financial risks that are really important for directors to consider, some advocacy governance issues, and also some human resources issues. The bulk of what I want to say from here on in, though, relates to clinical governance, because I think this is an area where not many organisations have really approached the issue of clinical governance within their broad governance framework. It's certainly an area where commentators and others often don't talk about, but importantly, it's also an area where often those directors who are often recruited from, say, the for-profit environment don't really have a clinical governance background or understanding. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on this particular issue. The policies, processes and practices that serve to ensure appropriate clinical outcomes are achieved for clients when we have identified the risks that are associated with the services that we deliver. Those risks are really important for us to consider and might relate to not only the services that we deliver, but might relate to services delivered by other organisations, or might relate to risks that are in the broader environment in which our clients operate. We need to mitigate those risks as best we can, but like all risks, we need to prioritise them as well. We need to ensure that there's appropriate reporting around clinical governance, and this would include, in terms of a number of boards, appropriate training and introduction to clinical governance for those directors that might not have been facing clinical governance issues in, say, a for-profit environment. There is also a need for appropriate assurance. Like all governance activities, Clinical governance policies and procedures need to be implemented, but assurance of that implementation is also needing to be gained so that directors are closing the loop in terms of the governance framework that's relevant to the organisation. All of these things, though, in many not-for-profit and charitable organisations have to be framed with the people living their lives at the centre. That is, that you need to balance the clinical risk and the clinical response to those risks with the life choices that your clients might make. And this is a very difficult balance, and one that really needs to be thought through, perhaps not necessarily on a client-by-client basis, but certainly on a cohort-by-cohort basis within your organisation. When we think about things like the NDIS and the opportunity for choice and control that's afforded to people living with disability, we also need to think through what clinical outcomes might occur and what kind of risk directors individually and jointly face, and the organisation faces in relation to those clinical risks. It is different to service quality. At the end of the day, clinical risk relates to the clinical outcomes associated with the services you provide. They might be the mental health outcomes or they might be the physical health outcomes, but that's very different to service quality, and clinical governance or clinical risk is part of that service quality framework. So clinical governance and boards. The term clinical governance can mean different things for differing organisations. It is also different for clients, as I've already observed, and the nature of disability being supported in the context of things like the client's life, the client's choices and aspirations, the board's appetite for clinical risk, and the constant improvement framework that all boards should be undertaking in order to improve their clinical governance arrangements going forward. This is exactly the same framework as you would use for all of your governance arrangements. Directors must know what risks their organisations face and determine their risk appetite in relation to that determination. What does that mean? It means that really governors, those charged with governance, the directors of an organisation, should sit down and actually articulate their risk appetite in what we call a risk statement. This allows them to be sure about what kinds of risks they're prepared to take, but it also allows them to effectively communicate to the executives of the organisation and other stakeholders what their risk appetite is in order to drive policy and operations. So the next element, I think, that's really important for organisations to think about is the fact that clinical governance is really at the crunch point for boards. It is an area where clinical risks and clinical governance need to combine, and where boards really need to understand their obligations in that regard. It also means that you need to be thinking about individual and community solutions. So this is where governance is different to for-profit organisations, where that advocacy element and also where the capacity of charities and organisations to work with their colleague organisations within a service community to be able to develop solutions becomes very important. It also means that you need to think about the holistic services and the outcomes that are associated with those. In other words, is our relationship with our colleague organisations sufficient to ensure that we feel confident our clients are getting the services they need from external organisations, as well as the services that we provide? At the end of the day too, we need to make sure that other funded services are articulated into the care needs of each individual. This might include funded services in areas such as direct health in tertiary hospitals, or education services, or any other state or territory funded arrangements that support the lives of the people that we look after. At the end of the day, you also need to remember that service quality and reputation risk are really germane to this clinical governance environment. Getting things wrong is almost inevitable in a clinical risk environment, but how you mitigate, how you get out of from under that error, and how you make sure that error doesn't occur again becomes a really important issue from a reputational perspective, as well as from a risk governance perspective. So at the end of the day too, we need to make sure that we have recognised some of the traditional blocks to clinical governance that exists in boards around Australia. For instance, there are often cultural blocks to reporting, which for instance might mean that staff are not really happy to report the mistakes that they might make. There might be a culture where staff are concerned about having a risk attributed to them and being in trouble, if you like, for making an error rather than being supported in being able to rectify errors that have been made. Boards also don't necessarily know what to ask in relation to clinical risk, and this is particularly true of many people who come onto a board from a for-profit or commercial environment that often doesn't have a health background related to it. A lack of external evaluative capacity is also really important. For instance, we know that auditors are very good at auditing financial reports, but it is very difficult often to find external assurance or external evaluation capacity in relation to clinical risks that might relate to your organisation. And then finally, and often, there is a feeling amongst board members that money trumps clinical governance. At the end of the day, clinical governance is more critical than financial governance in an organisation and should be prioritised accordingly. Finally, and I just provide this clinical governance framework to be able to allow those people looking at this webinar to be able to consider how clinical governance might be orchestrated within their organisation. There's a number of elements to this particular framework which I'll let you look at yourselves, but at the end of the day, I think it's important to identify that standards need to be identified as a target for the organisation, that these standards should inform training and development for staff, and that clinical reporting and performance review should be undertaken, as well as an assurance process in order to identify shortfalls. The board should be well aware of these processes. Let's now just turn to financial risk very quickly for the last few minutes of the presentation. First and foremost, organisations need to understand the comprehensive cost of service delivery. They need to be able to determine a margin, and this is often very difficult for organisations because most not-for-profits and charities aren't orientated towards profit. But if you're not making a profit, then financial sustainability will be very difficult for your organisation going forward. Determining a margin means that you have a target margin. It doesn't necessarily mean you have achieved that margin. The third and perhaps most difficult point in all of this financial discussion relates to relevant range. The relevant range is that level of operation, so the number of services that you might provide, that allows you to maintain the quality of service that you need to within the financial capacity and service delivery capacity your organisation has within the locations that the organisation operates. What does that mean? It means at the end of the day that often organisations can become either clinically unsustainable or financially unsustainable, or both, if they allow their service delivery to increase beyond their capacity to deliver services. This is particularly a risk for organisations in an environment such as we have today, where mergers and acquisitions are often on the agenda for boards to consider in order to drive that financial sustainability. So system advocacy is the third issue that I want to talk about, and at the end of the day, I think this is a really important thing for those charged with governance to be considering. System advocacy relates to these success factors which charities and not-for-profits should be pursuing all of the time. For instance, strong partnership between sector and funder is an absolutely critical arrangement in order for human services particularly to be delivered. Price sustainability is also important within that clinical governance framework, and things like indexation certainty and evidence base for pricing are really important things that charities and not-for-profits should be advocating for. Flexibility in funding is also important, particularly if we're truly going to pursue choice and control for those people who we support. Again, boards need to be advocating for this flexibility. Identification of the true cost of doing business, cash flow and certainty relating to those funding arrangements such as the NDIS are really important for directors to be across, but to be advocating on as well. And then finally, being able to fund emergency services and provider of last resort services, including local decision making, are really important things for charities and not-for-profit boards to consider as part of their advocacy framework. Risks relate also to human resources management, as I indicated before, and indeed human resources management human resources costs rather, often represent 70% or more of the costs of charities and not-for-profits. But they also relate to 90% of service quality issues and 80% of the risks that organisations face. Considering governance arrangements and mitigations around staff quality, turnover, the design of staffing, so self-managed teams and so on, culture, quality control versus autonomy, training and utilisation rates are all incredibly important. What is perhaps most important though is that the staff profile is equated to the client profile, and as you can see in that diagram to the right of the slide, this element is a really important element to make sure that at the end of the day your organisation's delivering what your client needs within a clinical risk environment that's supportable by your board. The final couple of points I'd just like to highlight relate to timeliness of reporting and the need for the board to be able to demonstrate and identify for the CEO and others in the organisation what kinds of clinical issues need to be reported immediately, and also what regularity of reporting needs to be undertaken. The board needs to consider what kind of decision points it might have, for instance in relation to clinical risk, whether or not there are services that the organisation is prepared to provide and services that it's simply not prepared to provide because it's not resourced sufficiently to do that within a clinical risk environment that supports its work. The reporting of frameworks and training and policies that are workforce ready are also really important, but so too are practices such as having things like deterioration recognition frameworks for each individual client, having exception reporting, and also emphasising reporting around client mix are incredibly important, not only for clinical governance, but also for financial governance for the organisation going forward. And then finally, of course, it's always important for organisations to consider their quality improvement frameworks, making sure that they're using data wherever they can and analysing that data and information and disseminating it throughout the organisation. Reporting on culture, openness and having a learning focus for the organisation are absolutely critical for effective governance. Having a specific clinical governance team and being able to ensure that the board is reported to by that team on a regular basis. Also making sure that the data collected in relation to quality improvement relates to the actual service being provided so that you can see where the attribution is. That is, you can see what kind of activities actually lead to positive outcomes for the organisation. Remember, balancing clinical outcomes with life outcomes is also an important aspect. Most importantly, perhaps, make sure that you get advice. Finally, performance management and maturity indicators. For a mature organisation in all of these governance elements, it is important for the organisation to be longitudinally stable. That is, that it's stable over time. It is important for everyone in your organisation to understand the organisational intent and purpose, and it's important for the organisation to meet its policy guidelines contextually. That is, that the policy guidelines are met, but in the context of what kinds of issues your clients face and ensuring those clients get the outcome they need. Performance management and maturity indicators include recognising and facing the effects of policy honestly, and also relate to the fact that directors often need to ensure they have appropriate time and skills, and that the organisation invests in those directors to make sure that those time and skills are available to them to be able to do the work they need to do. Some governance warnings. I guess at the end of the day, over the medium term, organisations will compete for staff. There's no doubt that particularly in relation to carer staff, that organisations are going to need to be very, very strong in their recruitment retention processes in order to be able to align their staff with their client needs. Remember too, the market can remain very dysfunctional, and certainly dysfunctional much longer than you can remain viable. So you need to tackle market issues head on and not allow them to drag on. Data might be available and provides a competitive edge. You really need to look at that data, and you also need to ask for help, making sure that you get the appropriate advice to your board to allow them to be able to do the things they need to do. Finally, there are some clinical governance links that I've provided here that might make it easier for your organisation to understand what they need to do, but also perhaps to understand how they might get the assurance they need in order to ensure that the organisation's doing all the things it needs to do from a clinical governance perspective. The Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare and also the National Model Clinical Governance Framework will educate your board, educate your staff, and also provide some very good information about what kind of litmus tests you should provide to your organisation in order to make sure that your organisation is clinically appropriate. At the end of the day, clinical governance reviews need to be undertaken by people with appropriate clinical governance expertise, including training and also experience. This is not typically a process that's undertaken by an auditor. It's a process that's undertaken by a health professional, but a health professional that is relevant to the particular services that your organisation provides. Thanks very much, everybody. Really appreciate you listening, and I hope that that was useful to you, and I look forward to perhaps talking to you at some future point. Cheers.
Thanks, David, and thank you for condensing down what is a very complex area into 45 minutes. I know that I could, we've got so many questions, but unfortunately time has beat us, so maybe next year we'll have you back to do governance part 1, 2, 3 and 4 or 5 over the series of the week. And thank you everybody for dialing in for today's webinar. We've got 3 more webinars taking place this week. If you haven't registered, make sure you do. It's ourcommunity.com.au/NFP Finance Week. And on behalf of CommBank and our community, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. David, thank you again, and we hope you can join us for the rest of the webinars this week.